Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 116. This is our class for Wednesday, the 15th. And as you know, I had indicated that there is an extension for paper number one. So now I have our target date is 10/29 Wednesday, which would mean that we would be able to finish our fiction section in the event that you still aren't quite certain what you might be writing about for your first paper. And as you know, Citizen Kane is definitely a possibility, which is how we began the semester. But you can also choose one of the short stories. And we talked a little bit about A Sorrowful Woman, and we also talked a little bit about The Story of an Hour. And we were in the midst of discussing A Rose for Emily. I wanted to move a little bit more quickly by talking about three short stories today, and those are Young Goodman Brown and Soldier's Home, and finally Battle Royal. So I chose all three of these stories for very different reasons. All of them are considered part of the canon, those works that are considered by scholars and critics to be worth literary study. So they're oftentimes studied in literature classrooms. Now, that's not to say that you couldn't write a paper that one of these stories should not be part of the literary canon, because obviously that's one of the paper topics that I have suggested. And in the end, whether you argue something should or should not be in the canon is a subjective argument, and you should be able to argue both sides, actually, submit in two papers and do an equally strong job of both, depending on the pieces of evidence that you happen to select. And we had talked about the canon as having some rather general elements associated with it. It's usually got depth, it's usually got complexity, it usually has some sort of social statement, it usually has some sort of contemporary relevance. But for those of you who are particularly interested in contemporary relevance, I gave that as another option for a paper talking about a story or a film that does or does not have contemporary relevance. And again, it is a subjective sort of paper in that either position can be equally correct. It's a question of which pieces of evidence do you put together. And if you decided to go down that route, you want to make sure, though, that you don't lose control of the paper. You begin talking about contemporary society and you don't talk about the piece that you are examining, whether it be a film or a short story in this case. And you also have the option of creating your own essay topics, so that if it turns out that you aren't happy with either one of those topics, you can choose your own, but it has to be based on one of the stories or films that we've seen in class, and it also needs to be approved by me. When we began talking about A Sorrowful Woman, we were talking about some of the feminist statements that were embedded within the text. Once upon a time, there was a wife and mother, one too many times, that the story examines what happens when a woman, and the time period is always important in a piece, this would be the 1970s, when a woman seemingly has an ideal life but still is not fulfilled and does not have voice and does not have agency in order to be able to express that dissatisfaction. And the author wants us to sympathize with the female character. We may or may not, because the female character has responsibilities to family, not just husband, but child as well, that she does not fulfill. But we see throughout the piece the author using language and imagery and themes in order to support a grander social statement. And when we compare that to a piece like A Secret Sorrow, which was formulaic, written purely for entertainment and purely for profit, I hope you could see the difference between the two. And then when we talked about The Story of an Hour, as short as it was, it still had a lot of depth and complexity to it. I've often argued that the shorter the piece, the more difficult it is to write, or write well, I should say. And the story of an hour is written well and has very similar themes to A Sorrowful Woman. And in fact, Gail Godwin, the author of A Sorrowful Woman, was most likely influenced by the story of an hour, this time set in the 1800s, with a woman who believes that she's a widow. And we see how she begins to contemplate the possibilities of freedom that could be associated with that. And then it turns out that it was all a terrible error, and her death, and notice that both of these stories end in death, of Joy That Kills for the story of an hour, is much more complicated than what initially the individuals who surround Mrs. Mallard believed, because we got to spend time with Mrs. Mallard alone in her room and realize, along with Mrs. Mallard, all of the opportunities she would now have. And then when we talked about A Rose for Emily, this was a Southern Gothic piece that was written by William Faulkner, which is also part of the canon, that usually is read as an examination of an old Southern aristocracy that is experiencing descent, as represented by Miss Emily. And Homer could be seen as a new northern influence that is invading the South. And that if Miss Emily does represent an old Southern aristocracy, the inability of that aristocracy to move on to changing times. And that said, obviously, it could be a very formulaic story if we were to put the pieces together in chronological order, but that's one of the many techniques that Faulkner uses to make this story much more interesting by mixing up the chronology so that we can't guess the double ending. The first is that Miss Emily killed Homer Barron, her lover, because he wouldn't commit to her. And then the second being that she's kept the corpse and that she's laid with that corpse long after she killed Homer, because her hair turned gray long after that. And we end the story with that strand of iron gray hair, with an interview by William Faulkner where he seemed to give some rather unsatisfying answers about possibilities for the meaning of the title of Rose for Emily, which I would suggest there's lots of imagery associated with roses, whether we want to talk about flowers, or we want to talk about the verb to rise, or we want to even talk about the color rose, not quite white or red, someplace in between. And certainly when we talk about the flower, we could think about how delicate it is, but yet it also has thorns and can hurt. All of these seem to have possible suggestive meanings, and whether or not the author agrees or disagrees is irrelevant as long as we can come up with an argument that is at least possible. When we are talking about Young Goodman Brown, I wanted to talk about basically the history of New England. And that's one of the reasons, in addition to Nathaniel Hawthorne being seen as a canonical author. And Young is representational of innocence and being naive. And Goodman was the title that would have been used in the 1800s in New England, which is where we live. Basically, the Puritans, who were persecuted for their religious beliefs, were driven out of England, and they formed a New England here in the United States, and then ironically began persecuting others for their beliefs, calling them witches, which is what led to the witch hysteria in Salem. And Nathaniel Hawthorne, the author, was related to the Hathorns, and the Hathorns were involved with the witch hysteria. And Nathaniel Hawthorne was so ashamed that he changed his name and oftentimes wrote texts that were critical of that time period and that hysteria, which is what we see in part with Young Goodman Brown. And Brown, of course, is a common surname. We could say that this is perhaps a common story, but it's also suggestive of soil or being soiled. And if you know anything about the Puritan ethos, it was a very simplistic view of good and evil. One was either completely good or completely evil. And what Goodman learns in Young Goodman Brown is that people are much more complicated than that. We are filled with both goodness and evil. It's a tale where hypocrisy is exposed, where those who maintain their purity really have all kinds of secrets in the closet that Goodman discovers on his walk, his journey in the wilderness. And wilderness is wild and untamed. And this is exactly an allegory for the experience that all of us have. An allegory is basically a story that is completely symbolic. And while it's true that Goodman Brown's wife's name is Faith, it also represents his faith in humanity and in religion. And we know that he's leaving at sunset, and that suggests darkness and descent, and he's going into the wilderness, that which is wild and untamed, metaphorical journey that we all take, the coming of age story, where we have to learn that there is evil and hypocrisy in our world. And the fact that he's a newlywed, not only does it suggest that he's naive, but 3 months married, three is oftentimes a Christian symbol. And this traveler that he encounters along the way, which may or may not be the devil, shows him the reality of humanity. And of course, probably the central question you have when you're reading this story is, was this real or was it a dream? Goodman's experiences. In fact, Hawthorne even asks us, was this a dream that Goodman Brown dreamt? If it, and be it so, if you will, is the response we get, which is basically that it's not important. What's important is how Goodman changes as a result of this, because Hawthorne is very deliberate in making sure that each piece of evidence that he lists to suggest there is a witch meeting or that something supernatural is occurring, there's another piece of evidence placed to negate it. For instance, the wriggling staff, one would see that as supernatural, but that's undercut when we're told it must have been an ocular deception, that it must have been basically a figment of his imagination or his eyes playing tricks on him. And what we learn is that everyone is capable of sin regardless of the Puritan ideology of the time. Even Goody Cloyce, a church leader who taught Goodman his catechism, which would be comparable to a Sunday school teacher. The politicians, the professionals, the widows, the family members of Goodman, even Goodman himself, and that's the one piece that he cannot accept, that he himself is capable of evil. Because we see how badly this story ends. It was a dream of evil omen for Goodman Brown because he becomes a sadly dark and meditative man, for which there is no hopeful verse put upon his tomb. In other words, the lesson for us is not to completely lose our faith so that we become such disagreeable people that there's no possibility of salvation, which is what happens to Goodman after this experience, which might be a witch meeting, which might be a dream. I like the ambiguity because, well, humanity is ambiguous. We're neither good nor evil. It's complex, and as it is revealed throughout the story, all of the hypocrisies that exist in religion and humanity. Ultimately, we see how Goodman is unable to accept the fact that there is also hypocrisy within him. And if we were to go to the next piece, Soldier's Home, which is an easier read because it's in more contemporary language, and the topic of post-traumatic stress disorder seems very contemporary. But at the time of the writing of this piece in the 1920s, there wasn't a term post-traumatic stress disorder. In fact, it was known as shell shock. And there was very little understanding of the conflicts, I use that term deliberately, that a veteran would experience upon their return home. Hence the title Soldier's Home. This is a soldier who's come home, yet he's not truly home because he's misunderstood. And the question of what is home, what is the difference between a house, a physical structure, and a home, a place where you're welcomed and loved unconditionally, is embedded within this particular text. Krebs, by the way, is a term in German that means cancer, and one could say that war is like a cancer and that it continually spreads. Notice how our main character is continually referenced by his surname, much like he would be in the military, which basically removes individuality. That's the whole point of the military, is basically to have everyone work as a unit. In the 1920s, the idea of patriotism was that one would sacrifice one's life for one's country, and then one would return home and one would be welcomed back. And the reality is much more complex than that, as we see in Soldier's Home. And if you know anything at all about Ernest Hemingway, you know that he was an ambulance driver in the First World War. The war to end all wars at that point. No one could conceptualize the Second World War, but that is what happened. But nevertheless, a war on a global scale. And Ernest Hemingway saw some of the bloodiest, most horrible things as an ambulance driver, and shows us in Soldier's Home that war was not the glorified picture that was oftentimes presented in the media. And of course, the media back then was very simplistic compared to the media sources that we have today. And right from the very beginning of the story, we are set up for this by the comparing and contrasting of two pictures. One of Krebs initially when he was a student as an undergraduate, and he went to a Methodist college. So one assumes that religion must have played some role in his life. He is in a fraternity. Everybody's wearing the same height and style collar, which in some ways is reminiscent of the military, where everybody dresses the same and acts the same way. But the second picture, he's a soldier, where the uniforms don't fit and the rind doesn't show in the picture and the girls aren't pretty, which completely negates any kind of glorification of war. That the uniforms don't fit, so one is not necessarily going to look attractive in uniform. In fact, you could say that Krebs has outgrown his uniform. The rind, the idea that one could see the world by serving in the military, the rind doesn't show in the picture. And the girls aren't pretty, the assumption that for soldiers who would be male at that time, and the assumption that all soldiers were heterosexual at that time, would want to be a soldier in part because they wanted to be attractive to the opposite sex. And that isn't the case at all with the picture either. What we get is the ugly reality of war, where Krebs struggles with the fact that he came home too late, or at least that's what civilians think. This is a very critical piece of civilians, and that means he doesn't get his hero's welcome, even though his service was just the same. And that ultimately he goes and vacillates between two extremes of not wanting to talk about the war or wanting to talk about it. And both are unsatisfying, because he knows that what civilians want to hear is a story of interest. They certainly don't want to be told that he was bored much of the time. But they don't want a story that's too graphic either. They want the PG version, if you will, of war and its glorification. And we see how Krebs has changed because of the war, not necessarily for the better. He questions everything. He doesn't want consequences. He had consequences in the war, they were life and death. He says he would like a relationship, but he doesn't want to necessarily have a committed relationship. He talks about how he preferred the German girls because ultimately the German girls didn't speak English. So there wasn't a necessity to have lots of conversation. And the idea that now he's beginning to question religion. And we know that not only did he attend a Methodist college, but that his mother's quite religious. So we assume that religion must have had some role in his life. But again, after serving in war and seeing all of that death and destruction, one questions things such as, can God exist? One questions things such as, can I return back to normalcy, whatever normalcy might be? And Krebs's parents experience this and are completely dumbfounded. They don't understand why it is that Krebs can't return to his former self. What they want is Krebs to get a job and get married and settle down, and Krebs is nowhere nearly ready for that. And we can empathize with Krebs, we're supposed to. But yet we can also understand the perspective of the parents, that ultimately Krebs needs to be able to find a way to reintegrate into society. But What Krebs is doing is spending a lot of time in isolation with engaging in solitary activities like eating lunch at home, practicing the clarinet, playing pool, and notice that you point and shoot when you hit a ball in pool, and that's very similar to pointing and shooting a gun in the military. He spends his time reading about the war. This is how he gets his validation that he was a good soldier. He says he loves maps, and think about how symbolic that is because Krebs really is lost and he's looking for directions. And this is a dialogue-driven story, which makes it easier to read than a story with a lot of exposition or background information. We see lots of conversations. One of them seems almost troubling, the conversation he has with his sister. Now, his sister has another name for Krebs, and she calls him Hare, Hare, which is the rabbit, which seems to be an appropriate nickname for Krebs because he's scared and skittish, much like a rabbit might be. But she asks him if he can be her beau. Now, this is not a serious question in the sense of the possibility of incest. This is more of a question of hero worship where a very young sister is looking up to an older brother, and Krebs knows this nothing can ever come of this. So of course he can say, yes, I can be your beau, because he knows that this is a relationship that would not come with consequences. And she just wants him to spend time with her, to watch her play indoor baseball, which he ultimately does at the end, but more on that later. Now, the assumption is that Krebs has a closer relationship with his sister. She uses a nickname, after all, that usually suggests a closer relationship. Krebs's conversations with his mother are tense, to say the least. She wants him to pray when he's unable to. She wants him to get a job. She wants him to get a car. In fact, she even offers him the family car, which he was not allowed to drive previously. Krebs doesn't want that car because the price is too high. And the price is that Krebs return to a life of normalcy, that he use the car to date and to get a job and to reintegrate back into society. And when the mother asks him to pray and he says he can't, and then the mother asks, do you love me? And he says no, which is the wrong answer, by the way, that ultimately we see how lost and confused Krebs is. And note he never has any direct conversation with his father, which illustrates how distant their relationship is. It may have been that way prior to the war. We don't know. All we get is Krebs's return, but we certainly know it's that way now. And the mother basically serves as the interpreter between Krebs and his father. And the mother calls Krebs Harold. Makes sense that she would call her son that. But throughout the story is referenced again by the surname of Krebs, very militaristic. The ending of the story, where Krebs decides that he will go to Kansas City and get a job and watch his sister play indoor baseball. Perhaps a positive, because Krebs is now reintegrating back into society. Perhaps a negative, because Krebs is just doing what other people want him to do and he isn't getting the help and the support that he needs. Perhaps it's a little bit of both, because life is complicated, so of course literature is going to be complicated as well. I do like the fact that we don't get information on what happens afterwards. Better to be left wondering than to have a poorly written sequel. Not to suggest that Hemingway would have written a poorly written sequel, but nevertheless, I think that not giving us an answer at the end is the best way to end this particular piece. We do know that what Hemingway is trying to get us to do as readers is to understand some of the complexities associated with being a veteran in a time period when there was little to no understanding. And while we have more understanding today, there's still a great deal more understanding that needs to be done. So you can only imagine what it would have been like in the early 1900s. And then when we go to Battle Royal, this is part of a novel entitled Invisible Man. Not The Invisible Man, that's the science fiction story, by the way, of somebody who becomes invisible. Invisible Man was written in 1947, but its first chapter, entitled Battle Royal, was published as an independent short story, which is why we can read the short story without knowing the novel as a whole, which is several hundred pages long, and in my opinion might be perhaps the best novel ever written because it is so detailed and it reads like a short story, but for a good 400 or 500 pages. And that's no easy feat. Ralph Ellison wrote this when he was young. So he lived in the shadow of this work. It almost reminds me of Orson Welles, um, producing so much in his youth and then not producing after that. And that's basically what happened with Ralph Ellison. If Ralph Ellison had written this at the ending of his career, I suggest this might have been the pinnacle of his writing. And what we basically get in the novel, I'll briefly summarize it for you, is an adult narrator reflecting on their youth. And their first reflection is the short story that we were reading for class, Battle Royal. But I can tell you now that the way the novel progresses is that at the ending of the short story, where Invisible Man, note he's never named, he's just called Invisible Man because no one sees him because they only view him by his ethnicity. He's black. In a time period where there was blatant discrimination, racism, and prejudice and violence. Um, that's not to say that some of that doesn't exist today, but it was at a much different level in the 1940s. But what happens is that after our main character is presented with a scholarship, which would seemingly be a positive thing, we spend a couple hundred pages in the book with our narrator in college, and our narrator comes to the realization that he's never going to achieve respect or given voice or opportunity in college or through any educational system because he's black. So basically, it's a false promise that education can bring opportunity and freedom. And the next part of the novel is when Invisible Man decides to change a system that he thinks is rigged. So he tries to change the political system, and after much effort, he realizes that there isn't any way that he can change a political system that maintains that all men are created equal when that leaves out 50% of the population, and men is not in reference to black men. That the political system is just as rigged as the educational system. And do understand I'm oversimplifying here just to give you an idea of the novel. And then the last part of the novel is when our Invisible Man meets a character by the name of Ross the Destroyer, who argues that revolution is really the only way to enact social change and they need to destroy the systems in place, which they attempt to do. And at the very ending of the novel, we have Invisible Man, who basically is seeing his community burn around him, and he realizes that isn't the answer. So what he does is that he goes to an all Caucasian neighborhood that he would never be allowed to live in because of his race, and he breaks into a basement that's surrounded by darkness, but also light because he's stolen power from the power company. So he's got dozens of electrical lights lit up, and the idea of power and electricity is a major theme. And he talks about how he's hibernating. So, if you know the definition of hibernating, you're basically taking a rest, and the assumption is that eventually there will be an awakening and that action will occur. And in fact, the very beginning of the novel starts in the same way. So, this is basically the frame for the entire novel, an adult narrator who is in a basement surrounded by darkness, but also light, who is hibernating and contemplating what action to take when the educational system has not offered him opportunity, the political system has not offered him opportunity, and revolution has not offered him opportunity. And we are not given an answer. And again, I think that's brilliant from the author's perspective and from our experience, because now we are challenged basically to come up with the answer. And perhaps society has on some level, because certainly there is more opportunity, but there certainly is a long way to go as well. But the very first chapter of the novel, outside of the frame of the basement, is what we are reading for class. where the narrator is reflecting on his invisibility because of his ethnicity and talks about his grandfather's deathbed confession. And if there's ever a time for someone to tell the truth, it's probably upon their deathbed. And Invisible Man says he didn't understand it at the time, but he understands it now, years later. In other words, he had to experience all of the events in the novel to understand what his grandfather meant by saying that his grandfather was a spy in the enemy's country. So you think about a spy, they basically are gathering recognizance and using that information to benefit themselves and the real side that they happen to be defending. So the grandfather was just pretending to be meek and pretending to be an integrationist and passive so that ultimately he can find a way to gain access and opportunity in society. And the grandfather continues by saying he lives with his head in the lion's mouth. And think about how dangerous that is to have your head in the lion's mouth. The lion's mouth suggestive of Caucasian society, predatory. And overcome them with yeses. And basically, that this is all an act that the grandfather has put forth of being humble. This was the only way that he could think of to gain access and opportunity to try to gain some agency in society. Invisible Man doesn't understand any of this. All Invisible Man knows is that he's graduated from high school. And he's done so well and has impressed so many people with his graduation speech that the leading citizens of the town have asked him to give his speech. And it almost reminds me of Young Goodman Brown, where these are the leading citizens. Note they're all male. The doctors and lawyers and teachers and ministers and so forth. And what we find out is that it was all a setup, that Invisible Man was not called necessarily to deliver a speech, but to engage in a boxing match with his peers. And he's humiliated and he's brutalized. Yes, the N word is used. Yes, this is an ugly, uncomfortable, terrible piece. And I think that it's important to read because of that so that we can understand the ugly, uncomfortable history of the time period. And at one point, a naked blonde is paraded out and she's objectified. So it's not just about ethnicity, it's also about gender. And this naked blonde is tossed around like a possession and has an American flag tattoo. So she represents America, basically. And it's false promises. And for these boxers, these young black men, they can look, but they certainly can't touch. And that might be the same with America. You can look at the dream, but you can't have the dream of America. And at the time period, for a black man to look at a Caucasian woman, that could result in death. So not only are these men forced to look at this naked black woman, but these men are also physically excited by it, and they have difficulty hiding that because they're wearing skimpy boxing shorts. The humiliation and the fear and the degradation is something that makes the audience members feel a sense of empowerment with. And notice all of the black and white imagery in this text, which continues throughout the entire novel. But the leading citizens are wearing tuxedos, which are black and white. Of course, thematically, this is about blacks and whites. The men are smoking black cigars, so they're consuming things that are black. The scholarship is presented in white tissue paper. So not only is the color symbolism important, but the idea that tissue paper is very thin and insubstantial, which is what the scholarship will end up being. The scholarship appears inside of a briefcase, and a briefcase is oftentimes symbolic of professional success. I can tell you that I personally wrote a paper about the significance of that briefcase, which is mentioned maybe 4 or 5 times in the novel. And this goes to show you the complexity of the writing that Ralph Ellison has created, that something as simple as just a few mentions of a briefcase could result in a very complex academic analysis. The boxing match is, of course, a metaphor for all of the societal and personal battles that are fought by the disenfranchised, and specifically Invisible Man. And the other boxer, which is all set up so that Invisible Man is left with the strongest boxer, when Invisible Man approaches him and says, well, let's fix this fight and end this horror now, the other boxer says that no, he won't do it because his only pride is in winning the match. If there's any kind of pride whatsoever, they're supposed to get payment. At the ending, we see that it's fake payment. They were just tokens, and they are placed on an electrified rug. I had mentioned earlier how impactful electricity is because it's suggestive of power and who has it and who doesn't, which is a theme that's embedded in the text. And when Invisible Man is finally able to give his speech, and Invisible Man is convinced at this point that he can still prove that his worth, despite being humiliated and degraded, if he can only give his speech. At one point, he makes an error. If you are a fan of Freud and psychology, you would argue that there are no such things as misstatements. They're just the ways that our subconscious tries to find voice. But instead of saying social responsibility, Invisible Man says social equality, which, of course, is the exact opposite. And that stops the crowd right then and there as they demand to know what he meant. One of my favorite lines is when he says, oh, nothing, I was just swallowing blood. So if you've ever heard the expression of swallowing blood, that it's literal and it's also figurative. And you wouldn't know it from just the piece that you read, but the blues are a major element in the novel as a whole. So when the Invisible Man is beaten black and blue, I mean, that's literal because he has been in a boxing match, but it's also in reference to blues and an African American musical form. So at any rate, the idea of Invisible Man finally being given his scholarship, he thinks it's a positive thing. And it's negated by the nightmare that he has at the very ending of the short story. And before that, we're told how Invisible Man is standing underneath a portrait of his grandfather, which is suggestive of the idea that his grandfather is always present. You might remember something similar in Rose for Emily, where Emily is underneath a crayon portrait of her father, even though he's dead. The idea that he's ever present, he's omnipresent. But after that, Invisible Man dreams, and if you're into dream analysis, you can spend some time sort of thinking about what this dream might mean. That he and his grandfather are at a circus. The grandfather refuses to laugh at the clowns. Now, of course, when you're at a circus, you're supposed to laugh at the clowns, so this is a subversive act by the grandfather. But there are also other suggestive meanings in there that perhaps their lives are circuses as well. And clowns come with a rather a negative association sometimes. They can be rather creepy and can hide the truth. I know that oftentimes horror films utilize clowns, and there even are phobias associated with clowns. But nevertheless, the grandfather instructs in this dream Invisible Man to open an envelope. And in the envelope is an envelope and another envelope and another envelope. Almost reminds me of those Russian nesting dolls. And grandfather says that that suggests years. And then in the last envelope is a message to keep this end boy running. And the idea here is that Invisible Man is almost like a hamster in a wheel, and that society is continually manipulating him, thinking that he's going to get somewhere, but he's going to get nowhere at all. And of course, he wakes up from the dream, not truly understanding what that dream means. He says first he needs to go to college. And this is our introduction to the first major section of the book, where he goes to college thinking he's going to have all of this opportunity and all of this access, and he finds the exact opposite purely because of his race. And this book, as powerful as it is in terms of race, I've found that speaks to many people in many different situations. I think that everybody at one point or another has felt invisible. So just talk to your average adolescent. And the idea of wanting to be seen as an individual is something that perhaps we can all understand. And the fact that we're all in our boxing matches, so to speak, think about how class plays such a role in the idea of the 99% fighting against the 1%. And of course, if the 99% were to unite, they could overthrow the 1%. Much like in Battle Royal, if Invisible Man and his peers united, they could overthrow the audience that was there. But that's not what happens. People are basically scrambling for crumbs, or in this instance, Invisible Man's instance, for tokens on an electrified rug. So I think that those parallels are there. So that is one of the reasons why this piece is considered to be canonical, that it addresses lots of different experiences in the human condition, much like Soldier's Home, sadly. I always say I've never taught this story without there being one war occurring on the planet, if not multiple wars. It would be lovely if I could teach this story once before I retire, when I can say confidently there is no war right now, but that's not the case. And the idea of young Goodman Brown and that hypocrisy exists. And while all of us as jaded adults might realize this, just think about the sense of disappointment when somebody you've put your faith, I say that deliberately, in, a family member, a friend, a teacher, a politician, a organization, or even yourself, does something that is uncharacteristic or disappointing or is viewed as some kind of a betrayal. And how do we reconcile that without losing our faith? So, those are three ways, perhaps, that these stories can be timeless and universal. But yet again, we've got stories that are very old, and certainly when we continue on, we're going to get to be a little bit more contemporary. And we have stories that may not necessarily speak to everyone's experience. Not everyone is a veteran, for instance, as Soldier's Home examines veterans, but perhaps everyone understands the idea of trying to return home in adulthood and realizing that you're home and yet not home. So I leave you with these ideas to contemplate as I introduce our attendance question, which is going to be due on Friday the 17th. And certainly, if you need additional time, please let me know. Be happy to grant you an extension. And your attendance question is just going to ask you to identify an important quote in either Young Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, or Battle Royal. So you get to pick one of the three stories and indicate why it is important. And as you know, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are encouraged to respond to your peers. You are required to read your peers' responses and all of my responses in turn, which would give you a good idea of basically what it is that we're doing, or would be doing in a face-to-face class with discussion. So we're getting close to the end of our fiction section, which means that once we complete our fiction section, you will have all of the options that are available for you for a possible paper topic. And that means that we are moving to our next section. Our next section is going to be drama. And we will be talking a little bit about what drama is and how do we read it. This is one of the ways that we're going to catch up for being a little bit behind with our course outline, is that we can condense some of that. And then talk about three major dramas. The good news with drama is that you won't be reading as many as you were, or as many texts as you were in the short story section, but the bad news is that dramas are much longer. So we've got multiple classes devoted to dramas so that we can talk about them and also watch performance. And ideally, we would watch a live performance. We don't have the logistical capability of doing that. But since this is a literature and film class, maybe that's not a bad idea that we are focusing on filmed versions of dramas. And our three dramas, as we will talk about in the next few classes, are Oedipus the King, Midsummer Night's Dream, and Much Ado About Nothing. And what is ideal, I realize that life is not always ideal, but what is ideal is that you would have read a drama in its entirety. I'll give you the link for Oedipus the King next class. That said, it's included in your textbook as well. But you can find the link also online on your own if you needed it. But The idea is that even though we've got several classes devoted to a drama, you would have read that drama in its entirety by the first class that we're discussing it. So while we're discussing that drama, you've moved on to reading the second drama. So that by the time we get to the second drama by its first class, you would have read it in its entirety so that we can move on to our third drama. And Oedipus the King is a very old drama, and we are reading a translation. It is from 430 BC Greece, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why we read that drama. A Midsummer Night's Dream is by Shakespeare. Yes, written in English, but Renaissance English in the late 1500s, and we'll talk about some tips and techniques for reading that. And then A Raisin in the Sun, which is a much more contemporary drama written in the United States in the 1950s. And that'll be, I suspect, a much easier read. And of course, we'll watch performances of all three and talk about those performances. So, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class putting some closure onto the fiction section of the class. Take care. Bye-bye.